How did Elton Brand do? How did the Sixers fare? What's the East look like? And can anybody beat Golden State? Kevin Pelton, ESPN.com, NBA Insider, right now on the Sports Bash Live 97.3 ESPN. Kevin, welcome back. How are you?
I'm doing well. Recovered from the number of trades we had the last few days.
Yeah, wild, man. It was a fantastic deadline. It lived up to the hype.
It sure did. I mean, I think it was a lot of fun, particularly in the Eastern Conference, where you saw three of the top four teams make aggressive moves to get better this season.
Right, and Philly really set the tone. I mean, you saw them make the first move, and then everybody other than Boston really had to answer. Yeah,
of course, the key difference there being they were able to do it without giving up nearly as much in the way of draft picks, which is interesting. Toronto, only a 2024 second in their trade for Marc Gasol, and Milwaukee just a pile of seconds without any firsts in dealing for Nikola Mirotic.
All right, let me get your thoughts. Kevin, you are famous for doing your trade grades and the winners at the deadline deals here at ESPN.com. For all our listeners, Kevin does those breakdowns. And, you know, when you grade, let's start with the trade. You send Shamet and that 2021 pick, Chandler Muscala, another first-rounder and a second-rounder out to L.A. Tobias Harris is obviously the best player in the deal. You got Mike Scott and you got Marjanovic. So how did you view that trade? Because a lot of people looked at the 2021 pick from Miami and kind of thought, wow, that was a lot to give up there. Others would say, well, you got Tobias Harris. He was clearly what you need. I look at it as that 2021 pick was acquired to trade, wasn't it?
I mean, one of the big things that really guides my perspective is the idea that, you know, teams don't trade for players, they trade for contracts. And that's what makes this interesting because of the fact that Tobias Harris is going to be a free agent. And, you know, the Sixers can feel confident that they're going to re-sign him this summer. That fifth year is really important for Tobias Harris. He's probably not someone who's going to be a max guy in 5 years the same way that, you know, Kyrie Irving is or Kevin Durant. That fifth year that their current team can offer them isn't as big of an advantage in those cases it is with Harris. But at the same time, you're going to have to pay Harris the max or close to it. He's going to be paid market value. And so you're basically giving up these draft picks that the value of a draft pick is the chance to pay a player very little over the 4 years of their rookie contract. Shamet's on a bargain deal. You expect that the two future first-round picks can provide you some contributions at that low price. And so now the Sixers have a little bit less opportunity to add low-cost contributors around a core that looks like it's going to have possibly four max players.
Yeah, the one thing that this team had for years was all the assets. They had all the picks. They had all the assets. They're pretty much devoid of that now. They're out of assets. The hinky assets have all been used up, right?
Yeah, I mean, they got back to neutral then with the Markelle Fultz trade, which I'm sure we'll get to in a second here in terms of future first-round picks. And they still have a giant cache of second-round picks with which to work, even after giving up a couple in the Tobias Harris trade. But, you know, the additional flexibility, the ammo to go out and make a big move, that's now gone. But you did get, you know, an all-star in Jimmy Butler and in Tobias Harris, someone who, if he were in the Eastern Conference, probably would have been an all-star this year.
So in that deal, the Sixers clearly get the best player back in Tobias Harris. I don't think there's any debate on that, and he fits in here pretty good. But overall, the six-player deal with all the picks, how did you see that deal in terms of how Elton Brand did? Did you grade him well?
So I liked it a lot better from the Clippers' standpoint where, you know, they weren't a sure thing to re-sign Tobias Harris. Getting the two first-round picks in Shamet, great value from their standpoint. I wouldn't say that I dislike it as much for the Sixers as I like it for the Clippers. I mean, I think the case that you can make about it from Philadelphia's standpoint is, the thing that Harris allows you to do is you can go over the cap to re-sign and you've got full bird rights. And if the Sixers ownership is willing to pay the tax, then, you know, there's basically two ways you can win. You can either spend more efficiently or spend more money. The Harris trade helps you spend more money. So, you know, I thought it was kind of a neutral move. Maybe it was definitely more than I probably would have given up for Harris, but it does make them a much better team, give them a much better chance of winning in the playoffs this season.
Yeah, you gave Philadelphia a C- in that deal. Let me ask you how you think Harris fits in on this team. You got Joel, you got Ben, you got Jimmy, you got JJ. It seemed that Wilson Chandler was just kind of a guy, and now you insert Tobias Harris into that spot.
Very much so. A huge upgrade in that regard. And, he's a better shooter right off the top, shooting better than 40% from three. I don't know if he's quite that kind of a shooter, but, definitely a high 30s kind of player. And that's very useful alongside Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons. He's not someone who needs the ball to be effective, although he can make plays as a pick-and-roll ball handler. I think he's going to fit in really well. The one concern I would maybe have is, is there going to be enough touches to keep him happy is probably the fourth option in this offense. But as long as he understands and is happy with that role, then I think it should be an excellent fit.
Then they go out and make a couple other deals, lower profile ones. Let's go to the Fultz move here because obviously he is a high-profile name, but a low-profile return. But what did you think of the return that they were able to get a guy who you know pretty well in Fultz? You saw him a lot at Washington. I know we've talked a lot about how surprised we are that it's gotten to this point. But the point that it got to, how did Elton Brand do in return?
I thought pretty well in terms of value. I didn't. I recall when he first was diagnosed with thoracic outlet syndrome, or even before that, when he was meeting with doctors, kind of wondering what his trade value is going to be around the league. And I thought it might have been to the point where the best the Sixers could do for him would be a second-round pick, that they wouldn't even be able to get a first at that point. And some of the intel from people who are more plugged in is, he's got a bit more value than that. But the Sixers not only get an excellent second-round pick in that Cleveland pick this year, which will be at the top of the second round, but also potentially a first-round pick coming back to them, the one from Oklahoma City in 2020. And even though that's not a sure thing, I would say right now you look at the way that the Thunder have played this season, how well Paul George is playing, I think the odds are they're probably going to be one of the league's 10 best teams next year and send that first-round pick to Philadelphia.
Yeah, and the whole Fultz thing, it obviously just didn't work. Did you think that they should have maybe tried to hold on to him, or is this a deal just too good to pass up for where they are in terms of what they're ready to do?
I thought it was probably the right time to move him. I mean, there are people who will say, "Oh, this is as low as value could get." I don't buy that. I think it could have gotten worse had he come back from this diagnosis of thoracic outlet syndrome and still experienced difficulty shooting, still been ineffective on the court. The further removed you get from the prospect sheen from him being the player he was at Washington, and even in that summer league the first year, I think the less willing teams are going to be to invest a first round pick in taking the shot at getting him back on track.
How I know at the end of the day it's just been a bizarre story. No one really knows what to think or believe, but how surprised are you that it got to this, that they just basically had to give up on this guy?
I mean, I think, once he left the team after the Jimmy Butler trade and started looking for another diagnosis, it started to become clear. I mean, look, seemingly the entire time dating back to when Brian Colangelo was in the front office, Markelle Fultz's camp, the Sixers have not been on the same page in terms of handling what's going on with him. And, I think that made it difficult. And then also kind of their priorities changing from, we're not a developmental team anymore. We're a team that's trying to win the Eastern Conference this year. All the Jimmy Butler trade, the Tobias Harris trade, both signal that. You don't necessarily have time to wait around to see if Markelle Fultz can get back on track. That's kind of more appropriate for a team like Orlando that, probably is not going to make the playoffs this year.
You gave Philadelphia a B+. They got Jonathan Simmons, a player, back in that deal. What does he add?
I'm not sure how much he's going to play the rest of the season. Obviously, the Sixers do have a need for a wing. They also got James Ennis earlier in the day on Thursday. But he struggled this season, had fallen to some extent out of the rotation in Orlando. Oddly, I noted, Fultz has the 13th lowest shooting percentage this season outside 3 feet among players with at least 100 attempts, according to BasketballReference.com. And Simmons, of all people, is one of the 12 players with a lower shooting percentage outside 3 feet.
The irony is just unbelievable there. We're going to trade you for a guy that shoots worse than Markelle Fultz.
Yeah, which is not his track record. He had a much better season in that regard last year, where he was very effective from mid-range. Has never been much of a three-point shooter, but this year the mid-range shooting kind of fell off dramatically, and that's why he hasn't been as effective.
And you mentioned Ennis. The Sixers went out and got him, and you look at Simmons, you got Scott, you got obviously bringing in Ennis now. It looks like guys who can go out and defend on the three-point line was a theme here.
Yeah, and it's kind of 3-and-D type players. I mean, Simmons definitely much more on the D, Mike Scott much more on the 3 end of that spectrum in terms of their skill sets. And it's somewhere in between. Was having a nice season for Houston. He's kind of limited. He is maybe, in average. He was shooting the 3 really well this season, but more of an average-ish 3-point shooter, a little bit above average defender than a good player in both of those categories, but a guy who's not going to hurt you when he's out there.
I'm talking with Kevin Pelton, ESPN.com, NBA Insider, his grades. He gave a B for the Sixers, by the way, getting James Ennis there. Now, you put them all together in the pot. You got Boban, by the way, backing up Embiid now. That's something they've never had here. They've never had a guy really been able to step in and relieve Joel Embiid, right? I mean, so how do you find Boban as a backup now to Joel?
I'm very curious to see how the Sixers are going to use him because, he's always been so monstrously productive anytime he's on the court. But, teams have been reluctant to throw him out there night after night because of the fact that you can attack him in the pick and roll. His lack of mobility there is always going to be an issue. So, are the Sixers also going to see deploying him situationally or just try to throw him out there every night behind Embiid, which, might be the best choice, but maybe you can spot him a little bit with Jonah Bolden. I think the Sixers also would be thrilled if it doesn't sound like it's going to happen, but if Dwayne Dedmon came on the buyout market from Atlanta after he didn't get traded yesterday, and they could maybe look to add him at center.
Yeah, we'll keep our eye on the buyout market. Let's look at some of the other things that happened, especially in the East with Kevin Pelton here. Marc Gasol in Toronto. How does that change the Raptors? I don't like the trade all that much. I thought they made kind of a lateral move and gave up pieces for a lateral move there, but I don't know. How'd you see it?
I mean, certainly he's got the potential to be a better player, a more complete player than Jonas Valanciunas. Was still having a really nice season for Memphis defensively, even though he's fallen off a lot at the offensive end. You don't want to ask him to create a lot of his own shots anymore. The Raptors don't necessarily need that. I think the biggest question is going to be how Nick Nurse uses him, Serge Ibaka, and Pascal Siakam in the front court. Valanciunas had accepted coming off the bench. It was going to be okay if he didn't play a lot in a playoff series because the matchups weren't favorable. That's going to be tougher to do with Marc Gasol given who he is as a player and the career he's had. So that's, I think, the big question to me on that one.
Okay, and then, of course, Milwaukee gets Mirotic. This is a team that can shoot the 3. They bring another guy that can shoot the 3. What does that do for Milwaukee now? Best record in the NBA.
Yeah, I think it solidifies them as the favorites in the Eastern Conference in my mind. I mean, Mirotic is a really good fit for them offensively. Another guy to space the floor alongside, Giannis Antetokounmpo to really open things up for him. And, he kind of fits right in what Milwaukee hasn't actually shot that well on threes this year, but they just shoot them at such a high volume that it makes them very difficult to defend. And that's kind of what Mirotic's game has been. He generally has shot, a solid percentage, but not necessarily an elite percentage. The volume makes him a tough player to deal with defensively and a better defender, I think, than he gets credit for. So, even though maybe they probably would have ideally been looking for more of a pure wing, I think he will help quite a bit.
How about Boston doing nothing? Are you peachy keen with that, or were you surprised?
I'm not surprised by it from the standpoint that, number one, obviously their big target is Anthony Davis this summer, and they were thrilled to see him not end up getting traded to the Lakers yesterday. There wasn't as much, I think, that they could do to upgrade their rotation because of the fact that they're a pretty deep team. You have to get a really good player to improve if you're a deep team. It's kind of in some ways an advantage of, being top heavier like the Sixers have been after the Jimmy Butler trade, that it's easier to go out and pick up a James Ennis who can help you than it is to necessarily go from a solid player to a very good one.
All right, so you got and by the way, Wes Matthews goes to Indiana. Indiana's been hanging around this thing, even though they lost Oladipo. Should we continue to count them as part of a 5-team Eastern race, or is it a 4-team Eastern race?
It's interesting because, they still have a better point differential than the Sixers. The first, I think, 4 or 5 games they played without Oladipo, Tyreek Evans missed several of those games, and they struggled badly, and you started to think, wow, maybe, they are completely out of it, and it's just going to be, 4 walkovers in the first round for the teams with home court advantage. But then now they've gotten blowouts over the LA teams their last 2 games. Matthews is a nice fit for them. That was a bit of a surprise to me that he chose Indiana, but gets the opportunity probably to start and play a lot of minutes there and build his value as he looks for another contract as a free agent this summer.
Yeah, and of course, you see today, Wayne Ellington looks like he's going to go to Detroit. I was a little surprised. Why Detroit, right? I mean, the buyout guys, it's usually you get to pick where you want to go. I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah, it seems like both Matthews, Matthews is obviously going to a competitive team, but both Matthews and Ellington prioritize the ability to play a lot going into free agency this summer over the place where they had the best chance of winning a championship. And I'm sure the Sixers had some intel on what might be able to happen in terms of the buyout market with guys like Ellington and Matthews, and that was part of the reason you go out and trade for James Ennis instead of waiting to sign someone as a buyout.
All right, so you put them all together, Philly, Milwaukee, Boston, Toronto, Indiana's hanging in there. Now that the dust is somewhat settled on the trades, we do have the buyouts still to go, but it looks like this is what we got. How do you see the East?
So I think Milwaukee is the favorite in my mind right now. I would put Toronto second, and then, Philly and Boston, I think I could go either way on those 2 teams. I think they're very close, third and fourth. And, not a huge degree of separation between any of those teams, but I do think Milwaukee is the favorite.
The second round of the Eastern Conference playoffs is going to be epic.
Yeah, especially when you look at, between these 2 teams, you've got 4 max free agents probably in Kyrie, Kawhi Leonard, Butler, and Harris in Philadelphia. And then you've also got Milwaukee. All of their starting lineup plus Mirotic are free agents this summer. So it seems like there's a great deal of swing, a great deal of impact on what's going to happen this summer based on what happens in the second round of the playoffs.
It's Milwaukee, Toronto, Indiana, Boston, Philly right now 5, Brooklyn 6, Charlotte 7, and Miami 8. If there was a team outside of the 4 that we've mentioned, maybe Indiana, Brooklyn, Charlotte, Miami, Detroit, one of those, do you think could you see any of them being an upset special?
If I had to pick one of them, I'd take Brooklyn. They've played reasonably well, and have had injuries this season. Karis LeVert's just about to come back, and he's kind of their deadline pickup since he's been out a couple months here with that scary injury. Where at first we thought he was probably going to be out the entire season. So if he gets healthy and starts playing well again, I think they've got the best chance to put a scare into one of these top teams.
Kevin Pelton, the Sixers play Denver tonight. Denver's number 2. Is Denver the biggest challenge to Golden State in the West?
If I had to pick who's most likely to get to the Western Conference Finals right now, I would say Denver, both because they got the inside track to home court in the second round as the number 2 seed, and they also are a team that has dealt with a lot of injuries this season. They've very rarely had their entire starting lineup intact, so it's impressive that they've been as successful as they have been with those injuries.
That is Golden State, Denver, Oklahoma City, Portland, Houston, Jazz, Spurs, Clippers, Sacramento's in the mix. The Lakers are in the mix. Dallas is kind of hanging in there. I mean, the West is from 3 down is pretty wide open right now. It should be fun seeing the seeding over there. Sacramento's a fun team. They got Harrison Barnes at the trade deadline. They can make a playoff appearance, which would make Sixers fans happy with that trade going to Boston, right? NBA, down the stretch they come. Kevin Pelton, ESPN NBA Insider here, grading the trades for us on the Sports Bash. Thanks, pal.
All right, thanks for having me.